Who list his wealth and ease retain, himself let him unknown contain. Press not too fast in at the gate, where the return stands by disdain. For sure, circa regna tonat. The high mountains are blasted oft, when the low valley is mild and soft. Fortune with health stands at debate, the fall is grievous from aloft, and sure, circa regna tonat. These bloody days have broken my heart, my lust, my youth, did then depart, and blind desire of estate, whose haste to climb seeks to revert. Of truth, circa regna tonat. The bell tower showed me such a sight, that in my head sticks day and night. There I did lean out of the grate, for all favour, glory, or might, that yet, circa regna tonat. By proof I say there did I learn, which helpeth not defence to yearn, of innocency to plead or prate, bear too low, therefore give God the stern, for sure, circa regna tonat. What is it about the execution of Anne Boleyn that we find so significant? She wasn't the first to be executed by Henry VIII, and she was far from the last. We probably don't consider it as noteworthy today in English history, or even British history, when we have a civil war, an industrial revolution, 2 world wars and 1 World Cup doodah, and a certain referendum which carries more relics and leaves more scars on the country's past. Nevertheless, it was more unique than you may give it credit for. No Queen Consort of England had ever been executed before then, not even the She-Wolf of France or Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had much more dramatic fallouts with their husbands. English kings had been deposed, true, but they were either left to die or murdered in their beds. This was the first time a royal would be brought out in front of a crowd and killed, and just over 100 years later, it would be a king in his own right. Henry was demonstrating a flagrant abuse of his power. Forget Parliament, forget the Magna Carta, only Henry's happiness mattered. Would there have been a civil war without this moment in history? Would Oliver Cromwell have risen with his Roundheads if his great-great-uncle, Thomas, had not orchestrated Anne Boleyn's downfall? Somehow I doubt it. The execution of one's wife was barbaric in the eyes of the English people at the time. Even foreign powers reacted in disgust. Marie de Guise, future mother to Mary Queen of Scots, turned down Henry's marriage proposal when he was looking for his 4th wife, citing Anne's little neck quote. Christina of Denmark also rejected him by saying, "If I had 2 heads, I would happily put one at the disposal of the King of England." I find that when it comes to Anne Boleyn's definitive moment, it is not just her execution, it is the entire series of events between the 2nd of May and the 19th of May, which shows how quickly her downfall was orchestrated and how flagrantly Cromwell and his goons lied just to get rid of her. I'm going to analyse her arrest, trial and execution in this video today and compare how these events were reflected in their on-screen adaptations, which I covered in the previous video. Okay guys, before we get into the video, just to let you know, I have done plenty of research on this subject. I'll mostly be citing from Claire Ridgway's Anne Boleyn Files website, as well as her YouTube channel, as well as Dr. Kat's Reading the Past. And also, I got most of my sources from Alison Weir's Lady in the Tower. I got this in 2010. The dust jacket deteriorated. Just to show you, crap, where is it? This is what my handwriting looked like in 2010, and this is what my handwriting looks like now. Hold it a couple more seconds for you Star Wars geeks. Happy? Okay. Also, quick content warning. Obviously, we're talking about a woman getting beheaded, and we're going to be showing it several times by at least 8 different actresses. And also, for some reference shots, I'm going to be using a couple clips from Game of Thrones, so you're not going to see any actual choppings, but at most you're going to see some blood splattering, so if you're squeamish about blood, you have been warned. Okay? Enter at your own risk. Also, if you like the video, please leave a like and comment down below, and please subscribe so you can see more of my 6 Wives on Screen series as I go on. Arrest, 2nd of May, 1536. Anne Boleyn was at Greenwich Palace watching a tennis match when Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, summoned her and told her she was under arrest. It was possible that Anne was already ill at ease at the time, expecting something was going to befall her. Henry had left the May-Day joust with no ceremony just the day before, but even prior to that, she had charged her friend and chaplain, Matthew Parker, to take care of Princess Elizabeth, should anything happen to her. He swore he would, and he ended up keeping his promise, becoming an archbishop when the princess became queen. The young Elizabeth might have been in the palace on the day of the arrest, but by the time her mother was killed, she would have been moved back to Hatfield, out of sight of the king who had just disinherited her. Taken by barge, Anne travelled with Norfolk, Cromwell, Sandys, Oxford and William Kingston up the River Thames towards the Tower of London, which was about 6 miles away. In broad daylight, everyone walking by the river would have seen the Queen being escorted under such a heavy guard. When she reached the Tower Wharf on the north bank, cannons sounded to announce her arrival. This is a diagram of what the Tower of London would have looked like in 1536. We think that because Anne was charged with treason, she would have entered at this spot, Traitor's Gate, but instead she actually came through this gateway a little further down, which was how royals tended to arrive at the Tower of London, by river. When she arrived, she asked Kingston if she was to go to a dungeon. Remember that, as it's important when we get to the screen analyses. Kingston distinctly said she would not go to a dungeon, and instead be held in the royal apartments, which would have been part of the palace there. It's strange of us to think that there would have been a palace complex at the Tower of London, because we see it more as a prison now. In truth, it started as a stronghold after the Norman conquest. Henry III used it as his main palace when he was king. The next 3 Edwards after him would build on the site, and Henry VIII renovated the apartments for Anne's coronation. Its bloody reputation, while in the making, wasn't fully cemented yet. So far, the only 2 true bloody tales that had happened in its history was the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, as well as the execution of Lord Hastings, which had happened within hours when Richard III decided he was an obstacle that needed to be gotten rid of. Before the men who came with her turned to leave, she asked them to speak to the king on her behalf, but they made no comment and turned away. Trial, 15th of May 1536. We might take our current liberties for granted when it comes to due process and fair trials today. You could be accused of mass murder tomorrow, but you would still be given the right to an attorney, as well as an impartial judge and jury to sit on the case and have an unbiased view of the circumstances. You would be given the right and time to construct your own defence, gather evidence and acquire witnesses, and if you feel the verdict has gone against your favour, then you can appeal. Even in America, when you're sentenced to death, you have several years to appeal until you're executed, in case new evidence comes up. Anne Boleyn had none of those things. One can't exactly call a trial impartial when your own uncle has the pleasure of sentencing you to death. While her fellow accused were tried at Westminster Hall, save for George, who was tried immediately after Anne, Anne was tried in the Great Hall at the Royal Palace within the Tower. This and the royal apartments no longer exist. The Tower fell into years of decay following Elizabeth I's reign, and continued through the 18th century when the royal apartments were eventually demolished. The Tower might not still be around today if Queen Victoria hadn't decided to restore them. I cannot state enough how impossible it would have been for Anne to have so many affairs with so many men and not be caught sooner. 21 counts were specified by Cromwell between 6th of October 1533 and 8th of January 1536. There is no such thing as privacy when you are the Queen of England. Your ladies will be watching you day and night, servants come in and out of your rooms to tidy your quarters and make your beds. The Spanish are breathing down your neck, looking for a way to get rid of you. They would have spies within the court. But Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador at the time, couldn't find a single piece of evidence against her. There was no tangible pieces of evidence beside hearsay and conjecture, and those are kinds of evidence. Cardinal Wolsey, who may have been executed by Henry if he hadn't died on his way to prison in 1529, observed, "If the Crown were prosecutor and asserted it, justice would be found to bring in a verdict that Abel was the murderer of Cain," which just goes to show how corrupt the English judicial system was at the time. And believe me, it will get more corrupt from then on. Maybe it was worth cutting off a king's head just to get due process in this country. Anne could do very little besides keep her composure and protest her innocence, because when the odds are against you, you may as well retain the moral high ground. Being religious as you are, you know that truth is on your side, and you're the one in God's grace, while these men are perjuring themselves. So you might as well stay in the right and be assured of your place in heaven after all this is done. The verdict was unanimous. Everyone pronounced her guilty, but when your king has ordered you to execute his wife, would you really say she wasn't guilty? Henry Percy, Anne's former suitor, also condemned Anne. Shortly afterwards he died childless. It is likely the anxiety of guilt of condemning a woman he once loved sent him to an early grave. Norfolk announced that she would be burned on the green or have her head struck from her shoulders at the king's pleasure. Anne would be returned to her chambers and await her fate. Execution, 19th of May 1536. Anne was quite the fashion icon of her time, and the apparel she chose for her execution was one last statement before she died, because if you're going to die, you might as well look good doing it. She wore an English hood, or a gabled hood, for the occasion, unlike the French hood we usually associate her with. This, coupled with the ermine mantle she wore over her dress, demonstrated that she lived as an English queen and she would die as one too. She wore a damask gown, possibly grey, over a red kirtle. This would be a striking contrast, but also a conscious one. Grey is usually a colour of mourning, and the red signifies martyrdom. Mary Queen of Scots would also wear red to her execution as one last hurrah against Elizabeth. For Anne, the red could have been a subtle protest of her innocence. She'd have left the royal apartment sometime before the hour of execution. The scaffold would have been somewhere around here. This whole area behind the White Tower is actually Tower Green, which we find strange today because most of that is now covered in cobblestones. The monument that sits within the walls today isn't actually the correct spot and is believed to have been a place which was pointed out to Queen Victoria by a yeoman when the renovations were going ahead. So Anne would have left the royal apartments from where this gift shop and the Raven enclosure sits now, and gone round the west side of the White Tower to a spot between it and what is now the Jewel House today. 1,000 people were gathered to watch her die. Kingston had been ordered to remove all foreigners from the tower so England's enemies wouldn't see this event, but a few slipped through the net and watched anyway. She passed the crowd with a bag of money and handed alms to the poor. Some sources state that she constantly looked back in the hope of a last-minute reprieve. I must emphasise that if you ever take up the mantle of studying Anne Boleyn, that sources are everything, and there will be some cross lines. For one thing, there is this thing called the Spanish Chronicle, that, because it's a temporary source written at the time, seems a reliable thing to go off of and quote from, but it is erroneous, to put it lightly. It worked more like a tabloid rather than an actual record of events. Basically, it's a twisted perception of Anne Boleyn, so if you ever find it being quoted, just make sure that you take it with a pinch of salt, or a whole pillar of salt. When it comes to her speech, I didn't mention that the version I quoted in my part 1 video was actually just one recorded version, but in fact there are many. Because they didn't have the means to copy down her exact words at the time, spectators would be relied on to memorise what she said and write it down later. I used John Fox's account, but some of the on-screen ones you're going to see later took the testimony of Thomas Wriothesley and Edward Hall. They all pretty much state the same thing, just worded differently. Where she announces that she has come to the scaffold to die, she would speak nothing about what brought her here, and not accuse Henry or his ministers of malice. But she would not confirm or deny her innocence either. She had to be kind to protect her family, especially Elizabeth. After her speech, she removed her queenly garments, the hood, the mantle and the jewellery. It would have been warm enough to remove the dress too, so she would just be in the kirtle and petticoat. Whether the linen coif was added after she removed her hood or was already underneath it is up for debate, but a coif would stop her hair from impeding the swordsman's aim if her hair fell loose, so it's fair to say that she would have worn one regardless. The blindfold is also speculated, but I think it's probably more likely that she would have worn one, as it would have stopped her panicking at the sight of the sword even if she saw it in her peripheral vision. The swordsman himself wasn't actually decked out like an executioner, as he needed Anne to be as calm as possible so he could have a clear target. He was dressed in regular clothes, so she couldn't pick him out. The sword was hidden so she couldn't see it. It's also believed that he took off his shoes, so she couldn't hear him move. He signalled to his assistant to fetch his sword, so Anne would look away from him, and her head came off swiftly. Reports of her lips and eyes moving are scientifically accurate. A head takes 13 seconds to die, as it is still full of blood and it quickly hemorrhages, depriving the brain of oxygen, which brings the actual death. The eyes and lips are motivated more by spasms at the shock of decapitation than actual consciousness. It is also impossible to sever the head without inflicting pain, as you're cutting straight through the central nervous system, but even then, it is more ideal to have your head come off in one strike than the constant hacking that some unfortunate souls, like Mary Queen of Scots, had to endure. Contrary to popular belief, there is no record of the headsman then lifting up Anne's head to display to the crowd. Surprisingly, not many interpretations of Anne Boleyn feature arrest, trial and execution. They may show one, but not the other two, or vice versa. They may skip over it entirely. I've been searching Wikipedia and IMDb for info about this film, but I don't think it was ever televised despite it having all the trappings of a TV movie. I guess the BBC made it to keep the rights so they could partake in that other interpretation further down the line. So yeah, it's just like what Roger Corman did with the 90s version of Fantastic Four. It makes so much sense now. This only features the arrest part of Anne's downfall, but they couldn't even get that right because apparently no one knew what yeoman looked like, and instead it looks like Henry got conquistadors to come all the way from Peru just to arrest her. Spared no expense, that Henry. We don't have an execution scene, because I imagine they didn't have enough extras to fill out a crowd. Instead, we have a closing narration done by Mary while they show stock footage of Anne's memorial on Tara Green, with all the terrible lighting and contrast of pirated footage, trying to avoid YouTube's copyright bots. Vanessa Redgrave's Anne doesn't feature her downfall, mainly because this film centres around Sir Thomas More, who was executed in 1535. Though there is a closing narration explaining that Thomas Cromwell was executed, the Archbishop was burned at the stake, and Thomas Howard narrowly escaped execution thanks to Henry's death, and Richard Rich died in his bed, there is no mention of what happened to Anne. Charlotte Rampling's version forgoes Anne's execution, having her last scene being the May Day joust, though she does notice Henry go, so she knows something's up. Instead, we have a scene between Henry and Thomas Cranmer. Henry is impatient for the guns to go off and clearly doesn't want to hear them. Even though he knows they're coming, they sound off without ceremony. Cranmer falls to his knees and prays. Henry kneels too, overwhelmed with the realisation that a woman he once loved is now dead because of him. There is no grand dramatic moment, despite Henry expecting it. I can understand this scene's intentions, but seeing as they went on to feature Catherine Howard's execution, I think the scene could have been played alongside a montage of Anne preparing and reaching the scaffold, while Henry and Cranmer are talking. Anne Boleyn's song in 6 doesn't outright reference her execution in the lyrics. They do mention that she was killed with a sword in her intro, and both she and Catherine Howard frequently reference being beheaded with overt bitterness in the dialogue. They even use it to invalidate Catherine of Aragon's arguments, saying, "Nice neck, by the way." However, Anne does get a few lines in the song where she says, "And now he's going round like off with her head." Yeah, I'm pretty sure he means it, showing that she was under a very good impression that Henry was going to get rid of her and it was going to be violent. Ugh, let's get this out of the way. I take no joy in addressing it. This must be what professors show their students at film school before making them write essays on how not to make a movie. Arrest. This is where the creators realise they're so incoherent they had to bring in narration just to clear things up. Anne isn't shown getting arrested. 1 minute she's staring out a window because this movie thinks staring out windows equals characterisation. The next we have this shaky tracking shot going through the cellars of a castle to make out that Anne is in a dungeon. Great, so even though you were filming at Haddon Hall, which is a Tudor manor frozen in time, and you could have easily shown a room within the house that looked a lot like the royal apartments, we go with a sodding dungeon. Just so you know, these interpretations get an instant C- for putting Anne in a dungeon because they've shown their lack of care for historical sources when literally one of her famous quotes is, "Shall I go to a dungeon?" and Kingston saying, "No, you will be put in the royal apartments." They don't even specify the crimes she's accused of, really. You'd have to know ahead of time that she's been falsely accused. Henry looks like he's getting rid of her because Henry's gonna Henry. Execution? Oh, God. This is where the acting goes from bad to unforgivably awful. Remember, I've seen a lot of community theatre, and thus far an Amdram version of Phantom of the Opera has been the only incarnation to make me cry. And a student production of Chicago I saw just before the first lockdown was much better than a professional performance I saw some years earlier, and that actually brought in West End stars, but somehow the community production had more charm to it because there was so much effort being put in by these students. Granted, I have seen bad community productions as well, but I'm not going to go into detail about those because if we go into bad community theatre, we're going to be here all day. The acting here will only make you laugh. Despite a dramatic shake of the hands, Kennedy's Anne just looks bored on her way up to the scaffold. Meanwhile, the Tower Guards have to shove spectators out of the way instead of them standing in an orderly manner and letting her pass out the arms. And of course, her outfit is inaccurate. It can't be a budget thing because she doesn't wear this dress anywhere else, so this dress was specifically made to be worn for the execution. Either that or it was a rental. I don't like that she wears the coif on her head and nothing else. Nothing screams regal about this. Then the blindfold falls off, followed by...
What?
Also, don't bow your head, idiot. All it's going to do is that when the sword comes around, it's just going to get smacked right into your jaw and there's going to be a lot of hacking and pain. When it comes to the sword execution, you must hold your head erect
and whistle a happy tune.
Oh, but the fun doesn't end when the sword has done its job. We get an amazingly fake blood splatter. And the camera cuts to this random boy who gets a bit of blood on his cheek. And he has the most flabbergasted reaction. Blood? No one told me there'd be blood in an execution. Oh. Helena Bonham Carter has had a lot of good death scenes over her career. This isn't one of them. Your tragedy is only as good as your victim, but when your victim looks half awake during the most terrifying events one can experience, forgive me if I don't get emotionally invested. Arrest? There isn't one. 1 minute Anne is in bed, mourning her miscarriage. Then we skip to her arriving at the tower, and once again, into the dungeon with her. At least I assume she's in a dungeon, because she passes by other cells on the way to her execution. Trial. I don't think the Great Hall at the Tower of London, which had recently been renovated in the Tudor style, would look like the interior of a sodding cathedral. I could get into the whole stop filming Tudor period pieces in cathedrals thing, but that would take too long. Can we get one scene where we're not zoomed right into her bored face? Please! No, Henry did not listen in on the trial. He didn't need to know if Anne was guilty or not. He was already convinced of it. As David Starkey put it, the best and the most convincing liars believe their own lies. Also, it's a little childish for HBC to keep rolling her eyes like a teenager, being told, "You can't see that boy again, Missy, blah 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 blah." Execution. Despite all evidence to the contrary, 2-year-old Elizabeth is brought in so Anne can say goodbye to her. Kind of missed the point of the tragedy there, where the fact Anne didn't get to say goodbye to her daughter leaves Elizabeth with no closure. I think drama won over logic here. One of Anne's ladies declares Henry will burn in hell for this.
Technically, that's treason.
A bunch of grubby hands from a Silent Hill game reach through the bars of their cell at Anne on the way to the scaffold, which breaks the sombre tone you're trying to convey there. And once again, Anne is severely underdressed. And why would you wear white to your execution? Are you trying to give the laundry lady one last middle finger? There's a weird shot of her mounting the scaffold, so it looks like the editor from Battlefield Earth popped in to take over for 5 minutes. And yeah, I understand that there would have been a large crowd of commoners witnessing the event, but did it have to be a wave of unwashed masses shouting abuse? There'd be some form of silent respect in watching a queen die. Plus, we don't know any of these people. Why should we care about their reactions? Shouldn't we be cutting to Cromwell and Norfolk instead, who were historically there and watched her die? When it comes to the speech, I have only one thing to say. Is this one of those universes where people can magically hear you even though you don't have a microphone and you speak like this? And it was like, I'm dying, by the way, bye. And let's not forget that fake dummy head. Granted, it's not the worst execution you'll see in this series, and when we get to Catherine Howard, you'll know. God, you'll know. I promise I won't be as harsh now, I just needed to vent a little about those last two entries. But yeah, this is a much better interpretation, even though we don't actually see very much of it. No arrest, but she at least looks as if she's staying in relative luxury, where she has a perfect view of her scaffold being built. There isn't a trial, but we get a general idea of why she's condemned from the intro and the gossip of court. One of the ladies says all the men accused with her confessed. This wasn't true, as only Smeaton confessed under torture, but it's likely that something was lost in the gossip and she doesn't know the full story. Execution. It's okay, not perfect, but for an off-screen job, it's tasteful. It's a black and white movie, so we can't determine what colour the dress is, but given that it's so dark, I'm going to probably say that it was black. And at least she goes to her death dressed as a queen, even if she doesn't wear a mantle or a gabled hood. The French hood is fine. They use a block in this execution, but they still use a sword, so I'm not sure on how the physics are going to work there, because a sword, when swung like an axe, is only going to cover so much of a surface area. Unless it would be like in Game of Thrones, where they do have beheadings by sword, but the condemned have to rest their shoulders and chest on the block and keep their neck extended. But seeing as Ned and John had Valyrian steel swords, they can easily get a quick stroke. And you see Janos Slynt there, he's at least wearing something that looks like leather, and something that can cut through leather in one stroke is no ordinary sword. And of course Henry and Cromwell wanted to give Anne a quick death, so it made them look better, because a barbaric hacking death or a burning death would just make them look like bloodthirsty demons. However, we don't get to see how the physics will play out there because we only see the execution as far as Anne mounting the scaffold. She remarked what a beautiful day it is, and then we quickly cut to Jane Seymour saying the same thing. Mere seconds later, the guns are fired, signifying that Anne is dead. All of a sudden, the gay atmosphere of the English court evaporates and Jane quickly crosses herself, suddenly sobered at the realisation that that could easily be her. As much as I love this movie, I have to admit there are some imperfections when it comes to the execution, but for Anne's character arc, it is a satisfying conclusion. Arrest. The timeline is condensed in this movie, but because it was based on a play, it has an excuse, unlike ITV's Henry VIII. A significant time has passed since Anne's miscarriage and her arrest, as Cromwell's interrogation of Smeaton in the prior scene seems like a culmination of his off-screen plotting. Anne is with Elizabeth when Norfolk arrests her, giving the infant child an almost traumatic departure with her mother as she walks away without a proper goodbye. Anne doesn't suspect that she's going to be arrested when Norfolk arrives, and instead thinks that he's just joking with her. It's a sobering punch when she realises that he's serious, and she's desperate to hold on to Elizabeth for as long as possible. It hints that she's arriving at Traitor's Gate, which is inaccurate, and even though Anne and Kingston make the dungeon exchange, the room she's staying in still looks like a cell, with carvings on the wall, and a gate with a lock. I'm guessing there was probably a lapse in communication between set design and scripting there. Trial. This scene belongs to Cromwell more than it does Anne. I'd love to see this recreated on stage someday. While the cast is restricted to their seats, confined in heavy cloaks, Cromwell is free to move around as if this is a circus and he is the ringleader. George and Smeaton weren't brought in as witnesses in real life, but it does serve as a final goodbye between the siblings who are so close. As for Smeaton, he never changed his confession in real life, but this version gives him a last chance of redemption by letting him tell the truth and not die a liar. And of course, Henry didn't show up out of the blue to force the truth out of Smeaton. I can't really defend this decision. It seems more that he's egotistically waiting for the verdict he's bought and paid for. At least it's well acted, which is something I can't say for that other version. Execution. I should be grumpy that my favourite Anne doesn't have an execution speech, but if it was there, this would have been one of the most perfect recreations of Anne Boleyn's death. But seeing as Anne and Henry had an epic shouting match, a few scenes earlier, it might break the flow of the narrative a little. Plus, it's consistent with Sir Thomas More's execution, where he tried to give a speech but was quickly stopped and was told the king had ordered him not to be heard. It's enough for dramatic purposes that Anne's final words are about the mayflowers she sees growing on the same tree from which Henry plucked a cutting on her coronation day. I'm not too fond of what she wears. I kind of wish she wore the same outfit she had at her trial, because the gable hood would have worked. The costuming in this movie is stunning for the most part. It did win an Oscar for costuming, and it deserved it. The actual beheading is a bit rushed. Rather than have the executioner panic and tell his assistant to distract her, I think it would have been more impactful to say, have the executioner raise the sword, and immediately cut to Henry out riding, only for him to stop and hear the guns, and be caught completely off guard, much like in Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Luckily, you're not left wanting for too long, as the final shot of the film is a long shot of Elizabeth hearing the guns and walking away, utterly alone, while Anne's last words to Henry are repeated as a closing narration. I wish the rest of the movie was like this. The trial and the execution were the first scenes I saw of this film back in 2009. Much like when you run into a drug dealer and they say the first taste is free, I got hooked and kept looking for more Anne Boleyn stuff from then on. Arrest. This bit kind of sucks, not gonna lie. Once again, condensed timeline, where Anne has a miscarriage on Saturday night and gets arrested on Sunday morning. In this version, Anne attempts to conceive another child with George, but they back out at the last minute because they realise it's just not right. Anne promises she'll tell Henry of her miscarriage in the morning and prays that he's in a good mood. What she didn't know was that Jane Parker saw the two of them and went to tell Norfolk. Cromwell doesn't exist in this version apparently, and Henry is pissed. She finds him leaning against a pillar looking grumpy. Resting angry face is Eric Barner's default expression throughout the movie, unless there's the scene where he actually has to move his face. He calls her a witch and storms off, calling for his guards while Anne is absolutely clueless, followed by George being dragged down a corridor, and Anne is now in a dungeon. The only enjoyable part of this is watching Anne's mother, played by Kristen Scott Thomas, smack Thomas Boleyn, played by Mark Rylance, and I'm sure anyone who's researched Anne in the past has wanted to smack Thomas Boleyn at some point for what he's done to his children. Trial. Short but sweet. Well, as sweet as a rigged trial can be. Great costuming. Acting is okay. Cromwell has his cameo. But for goodness sakes guys, turn a light on. Whose idea was it to have a trial at 6 in the evening? We gotta watch Pointless first, but we don't have time for House of Games, so we gotta do a trial. How can Cromwell read the indictment when it's so dark? But seriously though, when I saw this scene for the first time, I felt for Anne. I can't imagine how terrifying it is to be accused of a crime you didn't commit, only to be sentenced to death, and there is nothing you can do to save yourself. This version actually includes Henry Percy saying guilty, which Anne reacts to with a gasp. You wouldn't notice it the first time round, but if you saw it a couple more times then you would. You really want to punch Norfolk when he says the final verdict. Execution. I love this scene. It's not just Anne's, it's also Mary's. Mary, who has promised her sister that Henry will spare her, having pleaded for her life earlier, watches from the crowd, while Anne makes her way out of the tower towards the scaffold. The music is a bit much, but the procession is at least well filmed. It's a bit dour with the blue filter, but I suppose it matches the tone of the scene. 10 out of 10 for the costuming. This is probably the most accurate execution garb you're going to see among these interpretations. We'll ignore that anachronistic drain pipe in the background and get on to the speech. This version uses the account by Thomas Wriothesley, as opposed to the generally accepted version by John Fox. Anne stumbles towards the end of her speech as she spots a couple of yeomen who make their way towards Mary with a note from Henry, who goes back on his word, because Henry's gonna Henry. Anne and Mary share a look, and with a sigh, Anne starts preparing. This is the sort of thing I like to see, shedding the queenly exterior until she has nothing left and must stare death in the face. Taking off her iconic bee necklace is almost a symbolic act. Yes, she tears up a bit as she kneels down, but she keeps her composure. Her last ounce of hope has just been destroyed. Wouldn't you tear up a little bit? There's a good bit of editing as the sword swings and cuts to Mary closing her eyes as the sword makes impact, but we probably didn't need to see the aftermath of the blood pooling. 1 minute I'm sad, the next I'm like,
I'm not cleaning that up.
why is the rest of the movie not as good as this? Ah! This is probably one of the most theatrical scenes in the series. By theatrical, I don't mean it's over the top or ostentatious. No, I mean the appearance of it feels like how one would witness Anne's execution in a theatre, but not a very high quality theatre. The series kind of blew its exterior shot budget on the Jane Seymour episode, so a lot of scenes take place indoors and thus feel very much like a play of the week, told in 6 parts. For the execution, the illusion of being outside is kind of broken at seeing those plain white backdrops. Arrest. While Anne does know that her arrest is coming, it clearly establishes the claustrophobic position that she's been placed in. The last conversation between her and Henry involves him accusing Norris in front of her at the joust. Sometime later, Lady Rochford tells her Norris has been sent to the Tower. We next see her arriving at the Tower, presumably Traitor's Gate, though I think this is more a narrative shorthand than anything else. And she gets placed in the royal apartments. Good. Trial. I really like this version of the trial. Once again, it's a battle of wits between Anne and Cromwell. I should do a Cromwell rankings video. He gets some great actors to play him. But anyway, this shows just how intelligent Anne is when she responds to every argument and remains calm. No snarky comebacks, no eye rolling. Pure queen. Execution. Once again, this version uses Wriothesley's account of Anne's execution speech. I think this was the first on-screen iteration of her speech. Her clothes, while accurate for the time period, are nothing like what she wore in real life, but it's more of a thematic choice. At the beginning of the episode, Anne wears a lot of reds and blacks, as does Henry, highlighting their mutual passion. But towards the end, the red is gone, as is the passion, and Anne wears a light green gown with a white blindfold to show how drastically different her circumstances are now. Henry also has a scene where he tries on a new green outfit. This might be a symbol of jealousy, as he's convinced himself that he has been cucked. Sorry, enough of my A-level English colour symbolism. Unfortunately, this version also features Anne's head on a block, and I have to question why they didn't just use the axe, as it would make a much cleaner blow than with a sword if you're putting your neck on the block like that. Unless that guy has a lightsaber, that head is not coming off in one blow if you use the block. Of course, it fades out before we see the impact. With Anne being just as much a major character in this series as Henry, it's not surprising that the season 2 finale gives her a good send-off. Arrest. Anne is anticipating her arrest with dread. Hearing that Mark Smeaton has been arrested, she sends for Elizabeth so she can plead her case to Henry, but he's too far gone and leaves her begging for her life. Meanwhile, the walls close in on the men accused with her. I'm surprised that this is the only version I've covered that features Thomas Wyatt getting arrested too, but seeing as he was a supporting character, it makes sense that he has to be arrested too. Anne's father also gets arrested, but obviously he doesn't get accused with anything. It's more just to make sure that he doesn't do anything to protect his children. And it emphasises what a slimeball he is as he immediately sells his own kids down the river. Anne tries to be nonchalant as Richard Rich and Charles Brandon come to arrest her. Yeah, here's the thing about the Tudors. If they can composite characters, they will. And the Duke of Norfolk character disappeared after season 1. So Charles Brandon, aka Henry the Hairy Cavill, takes a lot of the duties usually assigned to the Duke of Norfolk, because it just makes sense to have this one character do all these things. The dialogue is reasonably accurate as she's taken to the Tower and escorted to her room. The apartments look a bit drafty, but it's a medieval fortress and it definitely looks more like a room in a castle than a dungeon cell, so I'll let it slide. Funnily enough, there isn't a trial. It happens off screen and Cromwell mentions it to Wyatt when he tells him he's going to be released. I'm not sure why. It's not in the deleted scenes, and my guess is probably budgetary reasons, where they'd spent their major trial budget on Thomas More's trial, so never mind. Maybe without Norfolk we wouldn't have the impact of Anne's own relative throwing her under the anachronistic bus. Execution. Watch this execution scene and tell me it didn't help Game of Thrones get off the ground. Anne does walk through the crowd of unwashed masses, some of whom shout abuse at her, but it's not completely overwhelming as in HBC's version, where we do get a mix of sympathetic people reaching out to touch her as she passes. Kingston does give her a purse to pass out alms, but she doesn't. We could have cut that line really. By the time she's done speaking, the mob has moved to silent respect. Dormer goes to the scaffold well dressed. though she could have worn a headdress to complete the look. Surely there was a French hood lying around. Now, her dress has a sort of purple tinge to the grey, but I actually quite like it because it gives a hint of royalty. As well as the masses, we get reaction shots from key characters in the crowd. We have Cranmer, played by Alec d'Urberville, who is the first to kneel when she starts to pray, and the rest of the crowd follows. Brandon, who never liked Anne, finds he doesn't take any joy in watching his enemy die, but he is still the last in the crowd to kneel. Thomas Wyatt, who always loved Anne, watches from a distance and weeps at seeing her die. It's like that scene in The Simpsons where you can pinpoint the exact second his heart rips in half. The execution is done with all the slow-mo and dramatic music we've come to expect from the Tudors, but it's at least tasteful and well shot, as when she is distracted she spots ravens taking flight and is transfixed enough not to notice when the sword swings around. And tell me you don't think of this scene when you see it. There's another scene to conclude the season which I think is really complementary to the execution scene, and is a good send-off of Anne and Henry's arc. So there was this swan that Henry noticed at the beginning of the episode, and he was watching it from a distance, almost predatory. And in the final scene, the same swan shows up on Henry's table, dead and stuffed, so it can be a glorified platter for a meat pie served to Henry. Henry digs in with his bare hands, a lot like Charles Lawton's version with the chicken, and he gorges himself. It's almost sickening. If you have a peeve about watching people eat very messily, then the intended reaction has been achieved. I originally thought this was foreshadowing for the third season, which would then open with Henry having gained significant weight, but for one reason or another, Rhys Meyer's Henry doesn't fill out, even in season 4. Instead, this is more of a metaphor as for how he's treated beautiful creatures for fleeting pleasures, especially Anne. Either way, it still works. I found this version surprisingly nuanced. It's interesting seeing this from Cromwell's perspective and his gradual regret of removing an intellectual equal because he doesn't want his head on the block. Arrest. We don't know how much of this Anne was aware of her impending arrest, though when Norfolk and Cromwell arrive, she seems as though she was expecting them. She does arrive through some sort of gate. It looks a little too narrow to be Traitor's Gate, though. She actually looks as if she's staying in a luxurious royal apartment, which would be a very nice place to stay if you weren't a prisoner. Trial. Mark Rylance really was having fun here, showing off how Cromwell has orchestrated these lies, even tricking George into giving false testimony. That's all I've got to say. Execution. This is an amazingly fresh perspective. No dramatic music, no ominous close-ups, no perfect sound even. I wouldn't be surprised if Claire Foy wasn't wearing a microphone in this scene. The only close shots we get are simply to capture her face, but mainly we stay at the same distance from the scaffold as Cromwell. Cromwell himself isn't victorious watching this. He has to hold his son's arm to get through it. How much must it suck to have your last words be drowned out by the wind, while Francis Bryan snarks his eye-patched arse off? There is no glamour in this execution. There isn't a glorious moment, and Cromwell knows it. This is the latest in a long line of Henry callously tossing aside those closest to him. Even in the final scene, as Cromwell approaches the king immediately after, he's well aware that it could be him on the scaffold someday. Foy's Anne wears a cloak and a headdress over her grey gown. Her costume motif has regularly included pastel colours, with her yellow one being rather garish, so another lighter gown works. And much like Natalie Dormer's, it does have a purple tint to the grey. On the way, she actually does hand out arms to those in the crowd who respectfully thank her. This version shows the common people as more apathetic of what's happening, as opposed to fully divided. Meanwhile, she keeps looking up at the tower in hopes the execution will be called off at the last minute. She's almost begging the powers that be for a last-minute reprieve. This actually shows the art of the French executioner as he goes through his task. Shots of the execution are intermingled with scenes of him talking to Cromwell about how he goes through his method. The trick is not to let Anne panic, as he can only achieve a successful strike if she remains still. She is blindfolded, so she won't see the sword before the executioner brings it out, making the crowd gasp. And you can only imagine she's panicking under that blindfold, but she doesn't dare move. He takes off his shoes so she can't hear him move, and successfully distracts her so she turns her head, and swipe, off it goes. Anne's ladies, who've gained sympathy for her over her imprisonment, prevent the guards from handling her as they take her off to be buried. The knife in your heart twists thanks to Francis Bryan, who cares so little, he pretty much says, "I'm off down the pub," while Cromwell and his son are still in shock. Spite and apathy are two very stark motives throughout this series. There's nothing glamorous about this death scene. Writing this script, I kept thinking from a very powerful line from Tom Stoppard's "Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead." I'm talking about death, and you've never experienced that, and you cannot act it. You can die 1,000 casual deaths with none of that intensity which squeezes out life, and no blood runs cold anywhere. Because even as you die, you know that you will come back in a different hat. But no one gets up after death. There is no applause. There is only silence and some second-hand clothes. That's death. And if I may paraphrase a little, if we have a destiny, then so had she. And if this is ours, then what was hers? And if there are no explanations for us, let there be none for her. It isn't until you start writing about history and looking at different on-screen representations of your favourite subjects that you realise how many perspectives you can approach a certain scene, which is why I had to give this whole series of events a separate video. These events you create, of course, really only have such an impact depending on how you build up to it. That's why some versions of Catherine of Aragon's Legatine court speech were better than others, because some haven't bothered to set up a full-rounded character, whereas Anne, more often than not, will get that full-rounded character. And by the time of the execution, we have to feel some sort of empathy for her, because you cannot imagine how terrifying it must be for dying and innocent. And even when you lack something, you have to make it up with something else. The Private Life of Henry VIII has little build-up of Anne's character, but because of Meryl Oberon's performance and the banter at court, the gaps are filled. But The Twisted Tale of Bloody Mary doesn't know what the hell it's doing, and coupled with terrible acting, it truly is the Birdemic of Tudor dramas. But of course, you can always write a character badly, and I've been watching this character be a bitch for an hour and a half, and now I'm supposed to feel sorry for her. I'm sorry, Philippa, but that's not going to work. For future adaptations, there are plenty of examples to take inspiration from. I like the idea of Anne going to her execution dressed like a queen and having to remove all that regalia. If you're going to focus on the spectators, use key characters and not have a horde of unwashed masses. If you're going to use a speech, I don't mind which version you use, but I think we definitely need a speech for her to go out on. And yes, we have an upcoming drama on Channel 5 with a new Anne Boleyn, and I, for one, am looking forward to it. Of course, I'm going to reserve my judgment until it actually comes out and see if the casting was done because the actress is good. I don't know. I haven't seen Jodie Turner-Smith in anything else. I want to know if they cast her because she's a good actress and not for novelty. So that is all I'm going to say about, but I hope it stems more towards the Anne of the Thousand Days and Six Wives of Henry VIII kinds of interpretations. We reached the end of the video. We got another one done, guys. Yay! I just have to say thank you for all the subscribers that I've just gained in such a quick time. Yeah, I wasn't expecting more than 100 at least, but because I'm my own worst critic. So you can say what you want down in the comments, but no one's harsher on me than me. If you like my video, please leave a comment, like and subscribe, and share it round. Hello to the 1% of my audience from Kazakhstan. When we get into part 4, we're going to discuss the constant themes and running patterns that we see in Anne Boleyn's adaptations, and I hope it won't take as long as these last couple of videos have been, given that this is probably my longest video so far. It's longer than my rankings video, I think, and basically we're just going to be discussing like how she's been perceived throughout the past 500 years, and we're going to talk about that extra finger that we'll get into the scientifics of that, and also we're going to sort of mention why we like to sex her up so much. Oof, that's going to be a hurdle, but again, if you're looking forward to that, please subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you guys again. Bye.